Sefer Shemos, and I'd like to continue with something we began talking about last week, taking it to another level. Last week we spoke about the idea of the case, the deadline, so to speak, for redemption. That Yaakov Avinu wanted to reveal the case to his children, the deadline by which time Mashiach inevitably must come. And I'll mention that the Gemara talks about people who were machashvei kitzim. There were people that tried to calculate the case, because you know that although Yaakov wasn't given permission to reveal it, the case is actually spelled out in the Tanakh. In the book of Daniel, there are a number of verses which exactly tell us when Mashiach is going to come. The problem is no one knows how to figure out what those verses mean. They make reference to numbers, but we don't know exactly what the numbers are and from when they begin. And so we have some cryptic verses that seem to reveal the case, but they conceal more than they reveal. But there were people throughout the generations, going back all the way to Talmudic times, who tried to figure out and delve into these verses and calculate exactly when Mashiach would come. And the Gemara gives a curse to those people. It says, Tipach atzman shel machashvei kitzim. That those people who try to calculate the case and figure out the meaning of those verses in the book of Daniel, and to tell us exactly when Mashiach would come, their bones should rot. Tipach atzman shel machashvei kitzim. That the bones of those people who try to calculate the case, their bones should rot. It's not a good idea. Not something that should be done. Why? So, the simple reading of the Gemara is, because since they are prone to error, and they predict Mashiach will come on this date or this date and this date, and invariably their predictions turn out to be false, they disillusion people and weaken their faith in redemption. You know, how many times can the so-called case pass without Mashiach coming before you begin to have your doubts about the very enterprise of redemption? So that's where the bones of the machashvei kitzim should rot. So you would think that that would have put an end to it. I mean, if the Talmud gives such a curse, who would try to machashev the kitzim? And again, and again, and again, throughout history, people try to make these calculations. Rav Saadia Gaon made a calculation, turned out to be false. The Ramban made a calculation, turned out to be false. Even in the 20th century, there were people who made predictions turned out to be false. So you'd wonder, like, what could the rationale be? Why should a person try to make these calculations if the Talmud gave a curse? So the Ramban says a fantastic thing. The Ramban says like this. The Ramban says that reason which the Gemara gives, that you shouldn't be machashev the case, you shouldn't calculate the case because you might make a mistake, and that's not the real reason why. That's not the real reason. The real reason that the Talmud forbade calculating the case is because the authors of the Talmud knew that it was far off. They knew that it wasn't going to come for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, and therefore they said, if you're going to try to calculate the case, and you come up one day, I have it, Eureka, I found the calculation, Mashiach is going to come in 1,000 years. It'll totally shatter people. So therefore the Talmud said, don't be machashev the case. But they couldn't reveal the real reason, because they couldn't say that we're not machashev the case because we know it'll be far off. That itself will cause terrible pain. So therefore they invented a reason. Don't be machashev the case because you might make a mistake. And blah, 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 blah. That's not the real reason. And therefore says the Ramban, since in our time it is so much closer, so the real reason the Talmud doesn't apply, and you're allowed to be machashev the case, and therefore the Ramban himself offers a calculation which of course turned out also to be wrong. He predicted Mashiach's coming in the 1300s. Needless to say, 600 years later, Mashiach hasn't come. Now, the interesting thing is that the Rambam, in his discussion of the concept of the Kates, wishes to draw an analogy and illustrate how difficult it is to make a correct calculation. And he says the following. He says that when it comes to the calculations in the book of Daniel, we're really at a total loss. Because it talks about such things as Edon, V'Edon, V'Chatzi Edon, a time and a time plus half a time, and we don't know how long these times are. But says the Rambam, I'll show you by analogy how difficult it is. There was also a case for the Egyptian enslavement. When HaKadosh Baruch Hu spoke to Avraham Avinu, he told him, Yodoa Teda, you should know, Ki ger yeh zaracha be'eretz lo lahem. Your children will be strangers in a foreign land. Va'avodum v'inu oisam, they'll be enslaved and tortured. Arba mei hashana, 400 years. Now that's pretty explicit. 400 years is 400 years. And yet, we find an amazing thing. That there was no precise calculation. Okay, 400 years is explicit, but when did the 400 years start from? So here there are a range of possibilities. One possibility is that the 400 years should begin from when God spoke to Avram. Now this prophecy that Avram had is when he was 70 years old. He was 70 years old. That was the Bris Bein Abasarim. That's when he had this prophecy. So in theory you could count the 400 years from that date, the date that God gave the prophecy to Avram. Another possibility is that it should be from the time that Yitzchak was born. Because in the prophecy it says, Ger yeh zarocha, your children will be strangers. So the implication is that this is really a decree not on Avram himself, rather on his children. So it should not begin until he has children, until the birth of his child, Yitzchak. Now Yitzchak, of course, was born when Avram was 100 years old. And therefore, that's an argument to start counting the 400 years from when Avram was 100 years old. Now, by the way, you know when Avram was born. What Hebrew year it was. One of those amazing, it makes you wonder if God had a sense of humor. It was the Hebrew year 1948. 1948. Which, of course, doesn't correspond at all to the Christian year 1948, but that's when Avram was born. So 70 years later was 2018. 100 years later was 2048. So perhaps you should count the 400 years from then, which would mean that the Exodus would be in the year 2448, or if it was 30 years before that, the year 2418. Another possibility is that perhaps you should count the 400 years from the time that the Jews went down to Mitzrayim. And of course, we know that Yaakov Avinu went down to Mitzrayim 190 years after Yitzchak was born. How do we know that? Very simple calculation. How old was Yitzchak when Yaakov was born? The Torah tells us he was 60. Yitzchak was 60 years old when Yaakov was born. How old was Yaakov when he went down to Mitzrayim? The Torah tells us he was 130. Okay? So Yaakov went down to Mitzrayim 190 years after Yitzchak was born. So perhaps you should count the 400 years from then. Well, again, if counting from the birth of Yitzchak places the Exodus at 2448, perhaps it really should have been 2638, which is 190 years later. Now, we know another interesting thing, that even after Yaakov went down to Mitzrayim, the enslavement did not begin right away. How long after did the enslavement begin? According to Chazal, the enslavement began when Miriam was born. Now Miriam was 86 years old at the time of the Exodus. So really, if we would count the 400 years from the beginning of the enslavement, we would delay the Exodus 314 years later, after it actually was. So we have a range of possibilities. We can count the 400 years from when God spoke to Abraham, from the birth of Yitzchak, from the descent of Yaakov to Mitzrayim, or from the beginning of the enslavement. Now, which turned out to be the correct one? It happens to have been that it was 400 years from the birth of Yitzchak. That was the correct calculation. And that's what the Exodus was in the year 2448, which is 400 years from the birth of Yitzchak. Yitzchak was born in the year 1548, and the Exodus was in 2448. That was the correct calculation. But the Medrash tells us an amazing thing, that there was a group of Jews which miscalculated. There was a group of Jews from the tribe of Ephraim who left Egypt 30 years early, because they miscalculated. They held that the 400 years really should have been counted from when God spoke to Abraham, which was 30 years before the birth of Yitzchak. And according to the Exodus, it should have been 30 years before it actually was. And they picked themselves up and left. What happened? They were slaughtered. They were slaughtered. So you see that miscalculating has a terrible consequence. Yes?
Abraham was the father of many nations.
Okay.
When it says his children, does it limit it only to
Yitzchak? Because
there are other nations enslaved.
They were biological descendants, but his real child was Yitzchak. So
it couldn't be other nations
that
were
it would have been only Yitzchak. Okay, so we see, says the Rambam, that it's a very difficult thing, that even the Yetzias Mitzrayim, the Exodus from Egypt, where the Torah is fairly explicit, 400 years, there are a range of possibilities. This is what the Rambam writes. Now, since the Rambam draws this analogy between the case of Mashiach and the case of Yetzias Mitzrayim, I would like to offer a conjecture. The Maharal raises a question that the Talmud records calculations for the coming of Mashiach. As we said, Rav Saadia Gaon had a calculation, the Ramban had a calculation, the Rambam himself brings a calculation, all of which turn out to be wrong. Now, this is a very serious problem. What does that mean? Does that mean that the great Gedolei Yisrael, the great sages of the Jewish people, were just mistaken on a biblical interpretation? Well, if they can make such a mistake, perhaps they made other mistakes as well. Right? Perhaps their halachic rulings are mistaken. In other words, why doesn't this undermine our confidence in the ability of the Chachamim, the ability of the sages, to give correct rulings in Jewish law, Jewish philosophy? If they can make a mistake on the interpretation of the verses of the Neil, who knows what mistakes they could have made in other areas? That's the question Maharal deals with. The Maharal points out a very interesting thing, that there is an expression that the Talmud uses in a certain place with reference to the coming of Mashiach, and says, Kolu kol hakitzin. All the defined times have passed. So there's a reference to multiple kitzim. There isn't a single case, but there are many kitzim. There are many times. So, Maharal says an amazing thing. You see, last week when we spoke about this subject, we pointed out that there are two possibilities for the coming of Mashiach. The verse says, Ani Hashem, I am the Lord, Be'ita achi shena, in due course I will hasten the redemption. So there are two possibilities. One possibility is Be'ita, the Mashiach will come in due course, meaning he'll come at the case, at the inevitable deadline. The other possibility is Achi Shen, it'll be hastened, it'll come early. So the Talmud says, what does it depend on? Zachu, if the Jews merit, it'll be Achi Shen, it'll be hastened. Lo Zachu, if they don't merit, it'll come at the case. Meaning that there is an inevitability to redemption. God did not merely plunk us down in this world and say, let's wait and see what happens. If you deserve it, fine, and if not, this will just continue on and on and on and on and on. There is a point at which redemption is inevitable. That is the case. And therefore, at that point, whether we're deserving or whether they're not deserving, Mashiach will come. And then, if we deserve it, then it'll come earlier. That's Achi Shena. Those are the two possibilities. But I want to point out, what I'll point out is that in the possibility of Mashiach's coming prematurely, not all times are equally auspicious. There are some times that are more auspicious than others. There are some times that are more auspicious than others. And let me see if I can give you a mushal to illustrate this. Let's say you want to shoot a rocket to Mars. You want to send a rocket to Mars. Now you know that all the planets orbit the sun. So there are times that Earth may be, and the orbits aren't synchronized. So there are times that Earth may be at one end of the solar system, and Mars will be at the other end of the solar system. That is not an auspicious time to send a rocket to Mars, because the rocket will have to travel a very, very, very great distance to get to its destination. And there are other times, and you can calculate this, that Mars and Earth are in close proximity to each other. And at that point, if you want to shoot a rocket to Mars, it's a very good time to do it, because it's a much shorter distance. Meaning that there are times that are auspicious for sending a rocket to Mars, and there are times that are auspicious for not sending a rocket to Mars. By analogy, it's the same thing with Mashiach. It's not that there's a single case, and we say that that's the inevitable deadline, and before that we have to be deserving of Mashiach. It depends. There are certain times that are more auspicious than others. There are certain times that it would be easier to bring Mashiach. Perhaps we would need fewer zuchuyos, fewer merits. And there are times that are less auspicious. At those times we need greater merit. So of course there is a single absolute case. There's a single absolute deadline. At that point it is inevitable. But before that point of inevitability, there are different times. There are times that are more auspicious, times that are less auspicious. There are times we can bring Mashiach with fewer zchuyos, fewer merits, and there are times that would require much greater merit to bring Mashiach. In other words, how might this be? So it might have to do with certain historical patterns. You know, there are times of benevolence on the part of the nations of the world. They'll be less resistant to the idea of the Jews establishing a state. Maybe those are times that are more auspicious. There are times that there's greater hostility. There will be times that are less auspicious. But there are, in the historical cycles, times that are, in a sense, easier for Mashiach to come, and times that are more difficult for Mashiach to come. Says the Ramban, the Maral, that the truth is that the verses in Daniel have multiple interpretations. Because those verses allude to all the kitzim, all the auspicious times. So Rav Sadia Gaon's interpretation was correct, and the Ramban's interpretation was correct, and the Rambam's interpretation was correct, and the interpretations the Gemara brings were all correct. They were all correct interpretations. Because each of them stumbled across one of the kitzim, one of the auspicious times. And it's true, those were times that it would have been easier to bring Mashiach. We didn't have even the minimal merit that was required. But there is one interpretation, which is the definitive interpretation, which yields the absolute case. So the great sages over the generations did not err. They didn't make a mistake in their calculations. Their interpretations were in fact legitimate, valid interpretations. they weren't the interpretation. Now let me illustrate this with a mashal. Now, let me tell you, before I give you a mashal, let me tell you about a mashal. An amazing thing, amazing Bertel from the Balatani and the Likutei Torah. It says that Shlomo HaMelech says, "Vayidaber shloshes alfei mashal." Shlomo HaMelech gave 3,000 parables, 3,000 illustrations, which seems to be a lot of parables. But the Balatani says, no, it's more than you think. It means like this. Let's say I'm trying to explain something to you, something very, very profound. So I give you a mashal, an illustration to understand the profound nugget of wisdom. But even the mashal defies understanding. So I have to give you a second mashal to understand the first mashal, which in turn enables you to understand the nugget of wisdom. But even the second mashal could be very, very deep. So we need a third mashal to explain the second, to explain the first, to explain the ultimate nugget of wisdom. So the Balatani says that Shlomo HaMelech's wisdom was so profound that every Dvar Chachma, every aspect of his wisdom, required a hierarchy of 3,000 Mishalim to understand it. So the 3,000 would explain the 2,999th, which in turn would explain the 2,998th, and so on and so forth, until ultimately you understood the first mashal and then the Dvar Chachma. So because of my analogy, I've been trying to explain to you what politics is like. And I'd say, politics is just like cricket. And you say, I don't know anything about cricket. So he says, well, to understand cricket, I'll use a mashal of American baseball. Okay, American baseball you're a little more familiar with. We don't really understand that fully either. So I say, I'll give you a mashal that is just like hockey. Oh, hockey I understand. So hockey is the mashal for baseball, which is the mashal for cricket, which in turn is the mashal for politics. Sometimes you need a chain of mashalim. So mashalim are very, very valuable. But I'll give you a mashal to explain the idea I'm bringing out. A very beautiful story. There was in Eretz Yisrael, in the Bayit of Gan neighborhood of Yerushalayim at a certain time, there were two great rabbis who lived there. One was the Hasidic Rebbe, the Amshnover Rebbe. The other was Rabbi Cheskel Abramsky, who was a Litvische Gaon.
Who was the first?
Rabbi Cheskel Abramsky.
No, the first one.
The second one.
The first was Amshnover Rebbe. The second one was Cheskel Abramsky. Anyway, one day Cheskel Abramsky is going to shul, and they tell him, oh, bad news. The Amshnover Rebbe was taken to the hospital last night, and they had to give him a blood transfusion. So Cheskel Abramsky says, "Oy, a blood transfusion is, you should know, every day I daven that I should not need a blood transfusion." So the person was very curious. He says, "Where does the Rav pray that he shouldn't get a blood transfusion?" So he says, "Every day in Birkas HaMazon, in the benching, we pray for that." What do we say in benching? He says, we ask HaKadosh Baruch Hu not to lead us lidei matnas basar v'dam. We should not need a gift of flesh and blood. So I have in mind, I shouldn't need a transplant, I shouldn't need a transfusion. Not a matnas basar v'dam, not a gift of flesh, not a gift of blood. Not an organ transplant, not a transfusion of blood. So the person said, that's not the meaning of the words. The flesh and blood is a meaning that I shouldn't be reliant on human beings for my livelihood. For loans, it doesn't mean a transplant, transfusion. So he says, who says? All words of prayer can have multiple interpretations. So this might not be the pshat, might not be the definitive interpretation. There also is a valid interpretation. Now the idea is that the Gemara says that mikra echad yotzel l'kama taimim, that a single verse can have many interpretations. There is no single interpretation of a biblical verse. In other words, God composed the Bible in such a way that every verse can have layers and layers and layers of meaning. And therefore, there may be one fundamental interpretation, but that doesn't preclude the possibility of others. So here too, we have these verses in Daniel, which seem to tell us when the case is. Yes, there is one fundamental interpretation. It's a reference to the ultimate case. But it doesn't preclude the possibility that it refers to the other cases. The other times they're uniquely auspicious for Mashiach coming. So therefore, all the interpretations are in fact correct, says the Maharal. Mashiach could have come at any of those times. I would like to conjecture that by analogy, it was the same thing with the Yetzias Mitzrayim. When God spoke to Avraham Avinu and said that your children will be enslaved for 400 years, it wasn't that God had one specific interpretation in mind. Just we didn't know which one it was until the story unfolded. It was indeterminate. The Yetzias Mitzrayim, rather, could have been at any of those times. It could have been 400 years from the original prophecy. It could have been 400 years from the birth of Yitzchak. It could have been 400 years from Yaakov's descent. It could have been 400 years from the enslavement. God ultimately picked one of the four interpretations for reasons that we'll discuss. But there was no inevitability. It could have been delayed. Let's understand the implications of this idea. In the mystical tradition, the Arizal says the following. We say in the Haggadah that Ilu lahotzi HaKadosh Baruch Hu Avosenu Mitzrayim, if God would not have taken out our forefathers from Egypt, Haray Anu Uvanenu Uvanei Vanenu, we and our children, our children's children, Mishubadim Hayinu Lefaro Mitzrayim, we would be enslaved to Paro Mitzrayim. If God had not taken us out, we'd be slaves there forever. Just as an aside. Now what does that mean, we'd be slaves forever? I mean, is there slavery practiced today in Egypt? Perhaps yes, perhaps no. But not the old-fashioned kind. I mean, modern countries have pretty much done away with slavery. So what does it mean? That if God would not have taken us out, we would still be enslaved to Pharaoh. Would there still be pharaohs in Egypt? That we sure don't have nowadays. No pharaohs in Egypt. No, but this is something you have to understand. That this itself is a subject for a whole class. Chazal tell us that the world was created b'shvil Yisrael. The world was created for the Jewish people. And what does that mean? It sounds chauvinistic. It means that the world was created because God has a plan for the universe. And the Jewish people are integral to the realization of that plan. If the Jewish people were to disappear, then the world would not progress. There would be no development, no change. Why? Because the plan couldn't be realized. God might not destroy the world, it's already here, but certainly God would no longer move the world, he would no longer direct the world, he would no longer promote change in the world, because that's it. The jig is up. The plan will never be realized. This is what it says, that all the historical change that has taken place in the many, many centuries since the Yetzias Mitzrayim are all really a part of the divine plan. But if God would not have taken us out from Mitzrayim, that would have been the end of the divine plan. And therefore, beyond that point, there would have been no progress, no development, no change. We'd still have pharaohs in Mitzrayim. We would still be slaves in Mitzrayim. That would have been the end. That would have been the end of history. The only reason there is any development is only to the extent that it advances God's plan. But had the Jews not been redeemed from Egypt, that would have been the end of God's plan. That would have been the end of history, the end of onward progress and development. So in the mystical tradition, the Arizal says an amazing thing. He says it's not just if God would not have taken us out, but rather it means if God would not have taken us out at that exact moment, it would have been up. Meaning that exact moment of the Exodus was critical. If the Jews would have stayed a moment longer, there couldn't be a redemption. So the way it's brought is this, that there are 49 levels of impurity, whatever that means. Nem tes shari tuma, 49 levels of impurity. And the Jews were sinking fast. And had the Jews not been redeemed, they would have sunk into the bottom level. They would have hit rock bottom, beyond which point they would have been irredeemable. And therefore, Baruch Hashem, God redeemed us when He did, because otherwise it would have been lost. Now that's a little bit hard to understand. I mean, 5 minutes would have made a difference. 10 minutes, 1 day would have made a difference. It's hard to imagine that 1 day could have made such a difference. That they were mamish just on the verge of disappearance, of descent to the lowest level of impurity and depravity, and it was in the nick of time. 1 day would have made it. That's hard to imagine. So let me tell you how I understand it. Right? There are a range of possibilities. There are times that are auspicious for the redemption. There are kitzim. There are defined moments. 400 years from the prophecy. 400 years from the birth of Yitzchak. 400 years from the descent to Egypt. 400 years from the beginning of the enslavement. There are a range of possibilities. Maybe there are more possibilities. There are a range of possibilities. At each of the junctures, there has to be a decision. Should the Jews be redeemed now, or should they not be redeemed now? Excuse me. But if they are not to be redeemed now, it's not a question that the redemption will come 5 minutes from now or 10 minutes from now. The redemption will come at one of these auspicious times. If it doesn't happen now, it will be delayed until the next case. So it's not a question that if it doesn't, if it wouldn't have come now, then 5 minutes from now it would have been too late. It means if it wouldn't have happened at this case, could the Jews have held out until the next case? Well, let's take the first case. The first case was 400 years from the prophecy. The next case after that is 30 years later, 400 years from the birth of Yitzchak. So at that first case, God made a determination that the Jews can still hold out. They are not deserving of redemption. On the other hand, it's not a question of now or never. They can still hold out for 30 years. So, let's wait. There were those who made the miscalculation. As we said, they were slaughtered. Now, it's 30 years later. It's 400 years from the birth of Yitzchak. When's the next case? The next case is 190 years from now. Because Yaakov's descent to Egypt was 190 years after the birth of Yitzchak, as we said. So now, it's a tougher question. Can the Jews hold out for another 190 years? So God said no. They're not going to make it. 190 years are not going to last. So it's true, if they would not have been taken out now, the Jews would have disappeared. Not because they would have disappeared in 5 minutes. It's not likely 5 minutes would have made a difference, or even a day would have made a difference. But they could not have held out until the next case. They couldn't hold out until the next time. And therefore it was now or never. Now or never. And that's why God chose that interpretation of the prophecy to Abraham, 400 years from the birth of Yitzchak, because waiting till the next case would have meant the Jews' disappearance. Now, by analogy, let's talk about our case. There's a famous Maimer Chazal. Chazal say that Ein ben David bo el bedar shekulo zakai or bedar shekulo chayev. Mashiach will only come in a generation which is totally deserving or it is totally guilty. Now, what does that mean? Isn't there a third possibility? If the Kates arise, if the inevitable time of redemption comes, won't Mashiach come even if we're 50-50? half are deserving and half are guilty? Why must it be all or nothing? And the answer is, because the Gemara is not speaking about all the possibilities. It's speaking about the possibility of Mashiach's coming prematurely. If Mashiach is to come prematurely, so there are conditions that have to be met. For Mashiach to come at the case, it's inevitable. It makes no difference. We're all deserving, all undeserving. Some are one way, some are the other way. It's irrelevant. But if for Mashiach to come early, conditions have to be met. The earlier Gemara that we cited says it has to be Zachul. We have to deserve it. But there's another possibility. The other possibility is that we are so undeserving that it's now or never. They tell a story that the Kozmitzer Magid, great Hasidic master, when he used to pray for the coming of Mashiach, he would say, Ribbono shel Olam, says, redeem them while they're still Jews. Or else you'll have to redeem them, they'll already been assimilated. But that's the idea, that when will Mashiach come? If it's a Dor Shekulo Zakai, if it's a generation which is totally deserving, Mashiach will come, because we deserve it. Conversely, if it's a Dor Shekulo Chayav, if it's a generation which is totally undeserving, Mashiach will also have to come. Why? Because if not now, when? It'll be too late. So the premature coming of Mashiach can be prompted for one of two reasons. Either the Jews are unusually deserving, or the Jews are so undeserving that if not now, they'll be beyond redemption. This as an aside, let me just mention that this, in theory, could make a very strong argument against our religious observance. Right? We're not doing our fair share to bring Mashiach. You see, it's not likely we can get everybody else to repent, that it should be Kulo Zakai. So perhaps we should turn bad and make it Kulo Chayev and bring Mashiach that way. So the answer is that we don't live our lives to bring Mashiach. We live our lives to do the will of the Ribbono shel Olam. Right? So it's true that maybe our observance of mitzvahs is bringing about a situation where it isn't Kulo Chayev. It's not totally undeserving, but that's not our responsibility. We aren't messianists. We aren't doing everything to bring Mashiach. We're doing what we do to serve the Ribbono shel Olam. If the result is that we're too deserving to bring Mashiach, okay, we'll have to bear that. So back to Mitzrayim, it's the same thing. At each case, at each juncture, there is a two-pronged dilemma. God has to make a determination. Are the Jews deserving on the one hand, in which case the Geula can come prematurely? On the other hand, are the Jews so undeserving that they won't be able to hold out until the next case? So I would even be so bold as to conjecture that, in fact, the Yetzias Mitzrayim was early. The inevitable case probably was one of the later Kitzim, either 400 years from Yaakov's descent or even 400 years from the enslavement, which was much later. But at that juncture, 400 years from the birth of Yitzchak, God made the cheshbon and he said, well, it's true, they may not be deserving at this point, but they're not going to hold out another 190 years. And therefore it has to be now. And that's why the redemption came when it came. Now this, I believe, is the interpretation of a paragraph we say in the Haggadah, Shal Pesach. There's a paragraph that goes like this. It says, Baruch Shomer Haftachaso LiYisrael. Blessed is God who guards his promises, who keeps his promises for the Jewish people. HaKadosh Baruch Hu Chishav Asaketz. HaKadosh Baruch Hu calculated the end. La'asais k'mo she'amar l'Avram Avinu bris bein Absarim. To do as he promised to Avram at the bris bein Absarim. And at that point we cite the verse that God tells Avram that your children will be enslaved for 400 years and so on and so forth. So the commentaries are all troubled. What does it mean? Baruch Shomer Haftachaso LiYisrael. Blessed is God who keeps his promise to the Jewish people. I mean, that's what we're praising God for, because he keeps his promises. Everyone should keep his promises. Even human beings keep their promises. Like that's, like, you know, blessed is God, He keeps His promises. It's also a very funny expression. What is a shomer haftachasu Yisrael? A person who guards his promises. Normally we would say he's makayim haftachasu. He fulfills his promises. What is the idea of guarding a promise? I think it's like this. Let me give you another mashal to illustrate it. Let's say you have a child, and you promise your child, I don't want to give you any bad ideas, but if you get straight A's in your report card, then I'm going to give you a big prize. Now, I was once in a shul, and in another city, and I'm sitting at Shalosh Shudas in the shul, and there are two fellows talking to each other, and one says, you know, I'm going to Israel this week. He says, really? How come? So he says, I promised my kid, that if he gets straight A's in his report card, I'll take him to Israel. And he got straight A's. I'm taking him to Israel. So the other guy didn't want to be, what up the ship, you know. He says, I also promised my kid that if he gets straight A's, I take him to Israel. But he didn't get straight A's. So I'm not going. So he also would have gone. Anyway, so you make a promise. Now there are two possibilities. Okay, you have the kid, and gets straight A's, take him to Israel. But let's say he's not quite a straight A student. He needs help. So let's say you don't give him the help. You don't help him with his homework, or as we do nowadays, you don't do the homework for him, as we're meant to do. So, and accordingly, he doesn't get straight A's. And therefore, you don't take him to Israel. Could it be said that you broke your promise? You didn't break your promise. The promise was conditional. If you get straight A's, I'll take it to Israel. You didn't get straight A's, we're not going to Israel. I didn't break the promise. But then you have another type of parent who very much wants to fulfill the promise. So therefore he sees to it that the kid will get straight A's. He studies with him, and he tutors him, and he encourages him, and maybe he oversteps the line and does his homework for him. Now that's a long discussion. Sometimes it seems to me that I'm going to school again. The teachers are sending homework for the parents to do. But
that's we get straight A's.
That's we get straight A's. So, but the point is, that's a shomer haftacha. A shomer haftacha is not merely a person who keeps his promises. A person who guards his promise is a person who so much wants to fulfill the promise that he actually brings about the conditions, the necessary conditions for the fulfillment of the promise. That's a shomer haftacha. Now here it's two. God made a promise. He made a covenant with the Jewish people that I will redeem you from Egypt. But this we know that every covenant, a covenant is like a contract. It's a contract. Then you make a contract, there has to be two parties to the contract. What happens if you make a contract and one of the parties ceases to exist? How could that be? Let's say, for example, you make a contract with a corporation, and the corporation is dissolved. And the corporation is a legal entity, has to be registered with the government, etc. There are laws that govern this, and the corporation dissolves, it disappears. So there's no longer a contract, because there's no party to the contract. The contract is between me and this corporation. The corporation doesn't exist. There's no party to the contract. So God made a covenant with the Jewish people that I will redeem you from Egypt. But what if the Jewish people cease to exist? They totally disappear. They become indistinguishable from their Egyptian neighbors. So at that point, God could not be criticized for not keeping his promise. Why? Because I made a covenant with the Jewish people. There are no Jewish people. They're gone. They disappeared. They've assimilated. Or they've been assimilated. So it's true, if you wish to praise God as a Mekayem Havtacha, merely as one who fulfills his promises, then even if you would not have redeemed the Jews, you could not have critiqued him. But God is more than that. God is a Shomer Havtacha. He yearns to fulfill the promise. And therefore he doesn't weasel out of it by saying, well, the necessary conditions weren't met. He calculates the case in such a way as to guarantee that the promise will be fulfilled. In other words, he could have said that the case is 400 years from the descent of Yaakov, by which time the Jewish people would have disappeared, in which case he's off the hook. He didn't do that. He said that I will calculate the case in such a way as to make sure that the promise is fulfilled. If that means counting the 400 years from the prophecy, I'll do that. If it means counting 400 years from the birth of Yitzchak, I'll do that. But I will see to it that the promise is fulfilled. He's a Shomer Haftach. And that's Baruch Shomer Haftachas Yisrael. Blessed is God who guards his promises in order to make sure that he fulfills the promise he made to Avraham Avinu, not just to avoid getting critiqued as a person who breaks his promises, but rather he so much yearns to bestow benefit upon the Jewish people, he sees to it that the promise is fulfilled, even if it means calculating the case in an unconventional way. And of course, I'll just mention as an aside, the famous remez of the Vilna Gaon, that Hashem calculated the case. The numerical value of the word case is 190. Kuf is 100, Sadi is 90. And that means that HaKadosh Baruch Hu calculated the extra 190 years, meaning because if he would have counted from the descent of Yaakov to Mitzrayim, the Exodus would have been delayed another 190 years. Instead, by counting from the birth of Yitzchak, it was 190 years later, or earlier rather. So that's Chishav Esakates. He counted the case. So this is an amazing, amazing thing. That HaKadosh Baruch Hu, there were alternatives. There were other possibilities. And the Jews weren't particularly deserving. But God understood that if it's not now, it'll be never, because if it's not now, it'll be delayed another 190 years. Therefore, let me choose this calculation. Why? In order to guarantee the fulfillment of the promise. I'll mention an interesting story that a couple of years ago, I was at a Sheva Brachos in one of these Parshias. And it was a Sheva Brachos that I didn't know any of the people. Why I was there is a long story, but I didn't know the chassan, didn't know the kallah, didn't know their parents. I just happened to fall into the simcha. Because I was visiting a certain city, and my hosts were going to the Sheva Brachos, and they snuck me along, and I was there, and they asked me to speak. So how do you speak? You don't know the groom, you don't know the bride, you don't know their family, you don't know anybody. So I got up as well. So I said like this. I said, this thought that I shared with you tonight, and I said like this, that, when you get married, chassan, kal, get married, there's a ksuba. Right? The ksuba outlines your commitments to one another. That's what a ksuba is. It states the responsibilities that husbands have to their wives and vice versa. So there are two ways you can keep your promises. You can keep your promises as a makayim haftacha, as a person who doesn't want to be accused of breaking his commitments, so he keeps his commitments. But if there's any legal loophole that he can utilize to avoid living up to the commitment, he'll do that too. And then there's a shomer haftacha, the person who so much wants to fulfill his promises that he sees to it, she sees to it, that the conditions are met. Says that's what a Jew is meant to be, not just a makayim haftacha, but a shomer haftacha. So if you're ever stuck at a Sheva Brachos and you have to speak and you don't know the people, you can say this verpo and you'll get away with it. But in any case, that's what the theme of the Parsha to bring up tonight is. That the Jews were in Egypt, as Rabbi Eliezer says, they were in dire straits. They were not deserving of redemption. They were not deserving of redemption. Whereas God had to make a calculation that was really not the real calculation. Why? Because if not now, when the Jews were on the verge of disappearance. And this is the same thing by analogy. There are many times that are auspicious. There are kitzim. There are multiple kitzim. All the interpretations of Daniel, and there are certainly interpretations that have not been revealed, reflect times that are auspicious for the coming of Mashiach. And in those auspicious times, there's this calculation. Are the Jews on the one hand deserving, or are the Jews on the other hand so far gone that if not now, When? That's Dor Shekulo Zakai, Dor Shekulo Chayav. And the Ribono Shel Olam is a Shomer Haftacha, meaning that he takes all the Cheshbonos in mind because he wants to make sure that ultimate redemption will take place. Because if we ever reach a juncture where in his determination we would not be able to hold out until the next time, Mashiach would come. If we ever reach a juncture at which we are truly deserving, Mashiach will come. It says if neither of those conditions are met, then we're bumped along to the next case. And in the next case, the same two considerations are contemplated. But that's really the idea of the Kitzim. I'll just mention one other interesting thing. We talked tonight about the analogy between the redemption from Egypt and the redemption of the Messianic age. Now this is a theme that runs through many, many Svarim, showing there are many, many similarities. Just want to share with you one last similarity. The Chassam Sofer points out an amazing thing. The Redeemer in Mitzrayim was Moshe Rabbeinu. Did Moshe know in advance that he was meant to be the Redeemer? He was an 80-year-old man. He's a shepherd. He's a fugitive from Mitzrayim. He's living in the land of Midian. One day he's tending his sheep, and he sees a burning bush. And he says, that's curious. It's a bush on fire, and the bush appears not to be consumed. There's Asur Naveh. I'm going to go there and see. Madua lo yivarasneh. Why does the bush not burn? And of course, there was an angel in the bush, and God revealed himself to Moshe Rabbeinu and says that my nation is enslaved. You are the Redeemer. Go to Paro and take them out. There was nothing in Moshe's life, there's nothing that happened before that was a clue to his being selected as Mashiach. It was like a bolt of lightning out of nowhere. God reveals himself to him. You're the one. Sends him to Messiah, and of course he turned out to be the Redeemer. The Chassam Sofer says the same thing. Because we believe that there is a possibility that Mashiach can come at any time. Which means that in every generation there are people that are worthy of being Mashiach. Do they know? Not necessarily. It could be just like Moshe Rabbeinu. That person who in God's estimation is fit to be the Redeemer is a person who is at this point clueless. He has no idea that he's the one who's going to be called upon. But when the time comes, the Rebbeinu Shalom will give him a tap on the shoulder and tell him, you're the one. And then redemption will be imminent. So the idea of preparing for Mashiach's coming doesn't mean that the Mashiach is taking Mashiach lessons now, that he's learning and practicing and working out his entire method or system for bringing out redemption. Because it will be just as Moshe Rabbeinu was at the last moment. He'll be given the nod. That's when the moment of redemption will come. And hopefully, Be'ezras Hashem, it should be Meher of Yameinu, swiftly in our days.
Amen.
But PARSHA SHMOT should be an inspiration for that. Everyone have a great week and the new year. And Be'ezras Hashem will meet next week.